There is exactly one rule to surviving around a ruthless enigma: keep your distance. So when I woke up on a first-class flight, completely draped across the most terrifying CEO in the corporate world, I knew my life was officially over. Welcome back to your BL boyfriend. If you want to see how one disastrous flight turns into a high-stakes battle of dominance and desire, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below to support the channel. Now, let's dive into the story. Part 1. Consciousness always returns in cruel, agonizing stages. First, it was the low, steady hum of the commercial jet's engines, a white noise that had lulled me into a much-needed coma after 72 hours of relentless board meetings. Second, it was the texture beneath my right cheek, impeccably soft, structured, and undoubtedly expensive. It felt nothing like the flimsy airline pillows they handed out, even in the first-class cabins. And third, the final and most devastating stage, the scent. As an alpha, I was accustomed to the heavy, sometimes suffocating presence of other alphas in the corporate world. Spices, smoked wood, burnt amber, heavy musk. We all carried our pride and our hierarchy in our pheromones. But the scent currently filling my lungs, wrapping around my senses like a freezing velvet rope, belonged to no ordinary alpha. It was absolute frost. Crushed mint, frozen pine, and an undertone of something so overwhelmingly deep and commanding that every primal instinct in my body screamed at me to lower my head and submit. Enigma pheromones. My heart stuttered in my chest, skipping a beat before shifting into a panicked, violent gallop. There were only a handful of enigmas in the global business sector. They were absolute anomalies, possessing a dominant instinct that could force even the most arrogant, established alpha to their knees without ever lifting a single finger. And unfortunately for me, I knew exactly whose scent carried this particular brand of absolute frozen authority. Slowly, like a man defusing a live bomb with trembling hands, I peeled my heavy eyelids open. The soft, ambient cabin lights of the first-class section illuminated the terrifying truth of my current position. I wasn't just leaning in my spacious, private pod. The divider between the seats had been lowered, and my entire upper body was draped across my neighbor like a clingy, exhausted koala bear. I swallowed hard, my throat sandpaper dry. I tilted my head up, my gaze traveling past a perfectly knotted silk tie, up the sharp, unforgiving line of a jaw that looked like it had been carved from marble, and finally met a pair of striking, icy gray eyes. Silas Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Global, the man known across international markets as the Ice Sovereign. He was a ruthless, untouchable enigma who could tank a rival company's stock with a single displeased frown, a man whose intimidating aura had been the subject of whispered legends in corporate lounges for a decade. He was power incarnate, and apparently, I had been using his broad, terrifying shoulder as my personal mattress for God knows how long. My brain essentially flatlined. I jerked upright so violently that my elbow cracked against the armrest, sending a sharp jolt of pain up my arm that I entirely ignored out of pure, unadulterated terror. Heat flooded my face, a violent flush of embarrassment that burned fiercely from my collar to the tips of my ears. I am so incredibly sorry, I stammered, the words tumbling out of my mouth before my remaining shred of alpha pride could stop them. My voice sounded entirely too loud over the steady hum of the aircraft. Silas Thorne did not flinch. He did not blink. He slowly lowered the financial tablet he had been holding in his left hand, the only arm that I had not been crushing with my dead weight. His icy eyes locked onto mine, analyzing me with the terrifying precision of a predator observing a cornered rabbit. "Are you finished, Mr. Vance?" His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a strange, electric shiver down my spine. It wasn't loud, yet it carried an undeniable weight that commanded absolute silence from everything around it. I froze. He knew my name. Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Innovate, a rising green tech startup that was merely a drop in the ocean compared to the massive, sprawling empire of Thorne Global. We were both headed to the Global Innovation Summit in Tokyo, a massive event where our paths were never supposed to cross. I had certainly never formally introduced myself to him. "You know who I am?" I asked, my voice betraying my utter shock. Silas tilted his head a fraction of an inch, his expression unreadable. "It is my business to know the faces of the industry's rising competitors. Though, I must admit, your public profile neglected to mention your tendency to hibernate on your rivals." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. I wanted to pry open the emergency exit and throw myself directly into the Pacific Ocean. But before I could formulate a desperate, professional apology, his eyes flicked momentarily to the corner of my mouth. "You also drool." My soul abandoned my physical form. I snapped my hand to my mouth, the back of my wrist catching a tiny, humiliating spot of dampness. I rubbed it away so fast I practically gave myself a friction burn. The turbulence. I was exhausted. I blurted out, sounding like a rambling, nervous intern rather than a 28-year-old CEO who had just closed a multi-million-dollar Series B funding round. You also talk in your sleep, Silas added, his tone maddeningly even, showing no mercy for my rapidly deteriorating mental state. Please tell me I didn't say anything compromising, I whispered, pressing my palms against my burning eyes. I could feel my own alpha pheromones spiking in distress, a soft, slightly sweet cedar scent that felt completely pathetic next to his suffocating winter storm. For a moment, Silas just watched me. The early morning light filtering through the small airplane window caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look impossibly ethereal and infinitely dangerous. You complained passionately about the volatile state of the tech stock market, and then you asked someone named Barnaby to bring you a blueberry muffin. An agonizing, deafening silence stretched between us. Barnaby was my golden retriever. I will pay for the dry cleaning of your suit, I said hoarsely, dropping my hands and forcing myself to meet his penetrating gaze. I am deeply apologetic, Mr. Thorne. It's been a brutal week of negotiations, but I realize that is no excuse for my total lack of decorum. Keep your money, Mr. Vance, Silas replied calmly, turning his attention back to his glowing tablet. If I minded, I would have pushed you off somewhere over Hawaii. Your posture was atrocious. I merely provided structural support so you wouldn't permanently damage your spine before the summit. I didn't know what to say to that. The ice sovereign, the most feared enigma in the corporate world, had willingly let a rival alpha sleep on him for hours because my posture was bad? The thought was so bizarre, so entirely out of character for the ruthless tycoon I had read about in Forbes, that I could only sit there in stunned silence as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our initial descent into Tokyo's Narita Airport. By the time the heavy wheels touched the tarmac with a screech, my dignity was still in critical condition. I spent the remainder of the flight aggressively staring out the window, desperately trying to ignore the subtle, intoxicating scent of frozen pine that permanently lingered in my personal space. Every time I shifted in my seat, I felt the phantom warmth of his shoulder against my cheek, a cursed, vivid memory that absolutely refused to fade from my mind. Stepping off the plane, the crisp, dynamic Tokyo air hit my face, doing little to cool the lingering, embarrassing warmth in my cheeks. My plan for the week was immediately rewritten and simplified. Grab my luggage, sprint to the summit's partnered luxury hotel, lock myself in my room, and avoid Silas Thorne for the remainder of the week. Tokyo was a massive, sprawling metropolis. The hotel had over 1,000 rooms. The chances of us crossing paths again outside of massive conference halls were statistically slim, or so I foolishly hoped. Walking through the VIP arrival terminal, pulling my sleek carry-on behind me, I quickly realized that ignoring Silas Thorne was scientifically impossible. The moment he stepped into the concourse, the entire atmosphere of the airport shifted. It wasn't just his overwhelming enigma pheromones, which he kept tightly, perfectly controlled. It was his sheer presence. People instinctively moved out of his way without even realizing why. Businessmen in sharp suits paused their loud conversations, their expressions morphing into masks of cautious respect and sheer terror. Corporate fixers and aggressive paparazzi, hovering near the exit to catch glimpses of summit attendees, immediately started snapping photos in a blinding frenzy. I tried to walk faster, to put as much physical distance between us as possible, but a throng of eager journalists surged forward, blocking my path to the exit doors. Without thinking, I took a sudden step back to avoid a microphone being shoved in my face, my shoulder bumping hard into a solid, unyielding chest behind me. A strong, warm hand immediately gripped my waist to steady me. The touch burned intensely through the thin fabric of my dress shirt. "Careful, Julian," Silas's low, rumbling voice murmured right next to my ear, sending a sudden, involuntary jolt straight down to my toes. His breath brushed against the sensitive skin of my neck. The casual use of my first name from his lips felt dangerously intimate amid the chaotic flashing of cameras and shouting reporters. "I'm fine," I said quickly, stepping forward and completely out of his grip, though my traitorous body instantly missed the grounding, heavy heat of his hand. "Thank you." Silas didn't reply. He simply stepped past me, his expression turning into a mask of pure ice. The sea of journalists practically parted for him like the Red Sea, too intimidated to block his path. I swallowed my pride and quickly slipped through the gap he created in the crowd, effectively using the terrifying enigma as my personal snowplow, all the way to the waiting fleet of glossy black Summit cars. An hour later, I was standing in the opulent, dizzyingly high-ceilinged lobby of the Summit's host hotel. The place was swarming with tech moguls, angel investors, and elite executives from around the globe. The air was thick with a clash of aggressive alpha scents, a silent war of dominance happening over cups of expensive espresso. I felt a massive headache building behind my eyes. I just wanted my room key, a very long, very hot shower, and 12 hours of uninterrupted silence. I stood patiently in the VIP check-in line, staring at the intricate gold leaf patterns on the ceiling, minding my own business. Then, the ambient noise in the lobby noticeably dialed down. I didn't even have to turn my head to know who had just walked through the massive revolving glass doors. The faint, chilling scent of mint and pine drifted effortlessly over the overwhelming wave of expensive lobby perfumes and aggressive rival alphas. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the smiling receptionist, sliding my passport across the polished marble counter. Julian Vance. Checking in. Ah, Mr. Vance. Welcome to Tokyo. The receptionist smiled brightly, her fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. Let me pull up your reservation for the week. Suddenly, the empty space to my right was occupied. Silas Thorne stood at the counter, his imposing height and broad shoulders making the massive marble desk seem trivial. He didn't look at me, instead smoothly handing his sleek, heavy black metal card to another receptionist who had practically materialized out of thin air to assist him. Mr. Thorne, an absolute honor to host you again. The second receptionist practically bowed, her voice trembling slightly. Your usual penthouse is ready and fully prepped. I stared rigidly ahead, clenching my jaw and praying my transaction would finish first. But the universe wasn't done punishing me for my airplane sins. Mr. Vance, I see you're booked in a standard executive suite on the 14th floor. My receptionist said politely, placing a sleek silver key card on the marble counter. Here is your key. Enjoy your stay. I reached for it eagerly, a massive wave of relief washing over me. Freedom. Solitude. A king-sized bed that was absolutely not attached to an enigma. But before my fingers could even graze the plastic card, Silas spoke. He didn't raise his voice, but the entire reception area seemed to hold its collective breath. Actually, Silas said, slowly turning his icy gaze toward me. The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a microscopic expression that I could only describe as dangerously predatory. Mr. Vance seems to have a habit of getting terribly lost and fatigued when he's exhausted. I'd prefer to keep a very close eye on my new rival. He turned his attention back to the stunned receptionist in front of him. Upgrade Mr. Vance to the adjoining suite on the penthouse floor. Put the entire week's charges on my corporate account. My jaw practically unhinged. I whipped my head around to stare at him. Mr. Thorne, that is absolutely not necessary. My company has already covered. I insist, Julian, Silas interrupted smoothly, his gray eyes locking onto mine with a silent, heavy command that made my own alpha instincts violently war between loud defiance and an agonizing urge to submit to him completely. Consider it compensation for your lingering neck pain. I wouldn't want you to be uncomfortable during our stay, especially since we have so much to discuss. The receptionist hastily recoded a new, gold-trimmed keycard, her hands visibly shaking as she bypassed my protests and handed it directly to me. I took it numbly, my brain short-circuiting as I stared at Silas Thorne. He casually slipped one hand into the pocket of his bespoke trousers, looking utterly unbothered by the fact that he had just hijacked my entire week. After you, he gestured toward the private, glass-walled elevators reserved exclusively for the penthouse floor, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. As I walked toward the elevators, my heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs, I realized with terrifying clarity that this business trip was no longer going to be about green tech presentations or securing stock shares. It was going to be a grueling, high-stakes battle for my sanity, my alpha pride, and quite possibly my heart. End of Part 1. Part 2. The private glass elevator leading up to the penthouse floor was an architectural masterpiece, offering a breathtaking, panoramic view of the sprawling Tokyo skyline. Under normal circumstances, I would have been completely mesmerized by the neon-lit concrete jungle expanding beneath us. Instead, my entire focus was completely consumed by the suffocating, terrifying reality of the man standing less than 2 feet away from me. The doors slid shut with a soft, final click, sealing us inside the transparent box. Instantly, the vastness of the city outside vanished, replaced entirely by the sheer gravity of Silas Thorne's presence. There were only the two of us inside. No reporters. No receptionists. No crowds to dilute the air. My alpha instincts, usually steady and reliable, were currently screaming in a chaotic mix of defense and primal panic. Being this close to an enigma in an enclosed space felt exactly like standing next to a dormant volcano and waiting for the eruption. The scent of frozen pine and crushed mint was no longer just a subtle undertone in the air. It was a physical weight pressing against my chest, demanding absolute attention. I decided the safest course of action was to stare aggressively at the digital floor indicator above the door. Floor 5. Floor 6. I could feel his gaze. I didn't need to look at him to know his striking, icy gray eyes were fixed directly on me. It was a physical sensation, like a laser burning into the side of my face. I shifted my weight slightly, my polished leather shoes squeaking faintly against the marble floor of the elevator. Floor 12. Floor 13. I glanced sideways. Just a microsecond of a glance, barely a flicker of my eyes. Silas was indeed watching me. His hands were resting casually in the pockets of his impeccably tailored dark trousers, his broad shoulders relaxed, yet he radiated a quiet, dangerous energy. When our eyes met for that split second, I immediately snapped my gaze back to the floor indicator. 5 seconds passed in agonizing silence. I accidentally glanced again. He was still looking. I quickly looked away, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. If you stare at the numbers hard enough, Julian, do you believe they will ascend faster? Silas's voice suddenly broke the silence, deep and smooth, reverberating against the glass walls. My brain stalled. I was merely observing the engineering of the lift. I lied smoothly, desperately trying to channel the CEO persona that had successfully negotiated billion-dollar green tech contracts. It's a remarkably fast ascent for a building of this height. Silas tilted his head slightly. The faint reflection of the city lights played across his sharp cheekbones. Is that so? Because you have checked the indicator exactly 6 times in the last 30 seconds. One might assume you are terrified of being trapped in here with me. Heat rushed violently into my face. I am not terrified, Mr. Thorne. I am simply tired and eager to review my notes before the evening gala. You are releasing pheromones, he observed calmly, entirely ignoring my pathetic attempt at a professional excuse. I nearly choked on my own breath. I am absolutely not. You are. Silas stepped just a fraction of an inch closer. The temperature in the elevator seemed to drop, the air growing thick and heavy. It smells like cedarwood, and something softer. Rain, perhaps. It's a very mild scent for an alpha. My ears turned scorching red. In the rigid hierarchy of our world, alpha pheromones were a status symbol. The most powerful CEOs smelled like bitter coffee, dark rum, or heavy smoke, scents that demanded submission. Mine had always been embarrassingly soft and sweet. It was a genetic quirk that I usually masked with expensive, spicy colognes. To have the most terrifying enigma in the industry dissect my natural scent was profoundly humiliating. My pheromones are perfectly adequate. I crossed my arms defensively, fighting the urge to take a step back. It's probably just the ventilation system mixing our scents. Silas studied me quietly for a moment longer, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, he said something that caused my entire nervous system to short-circuit. It is pleasant. I blinked, genuinely thrown off balance. Excuse me. Your scent. Silas leaned back slightly against the glass wall, his posture languid, but his gaze sharper than a scalpel. It is surprisingly calming. Most alphas reek of desperate ambition and aggressive insecurity. You just smell grounded. I stared at him, completely, utterly speechless. This was the same man financial magazines called a corporate predator. The same enigma who had reportedly hostile taken over 3 major European tech firms without batting an eye. And he was currently standing in a high-speed elevator, softly complimenting my pheromones like it was entirely normal. Before I could formulate any kind of response that wouldn't embarrass me further, the elevator chimed a soft, melodic note. The doors slid open to reveal the luxurious, dimly lit corridor of the penthouse floor. I practically lunged forward, eager to escape the heavy, intoxicating tension that had completely filled the small space. But just as I crossed the threshold into the thick, plush carpet of the hallway, Silas spoke again. Julian. I stopped, turning back despite every instinct telling me to run to my room and barricade the door. Silas stepped out of the elevator, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a large predatory cat. He stopped right in front of me, towering over my frame. The Summit Gala begins at 8 o'clock, he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that seemed designed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my chest. I expect to see you there. Try not to fall asleep on anyone else. And without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked gracefully toward the heavy double doors at the end of the hall, swiping his black keycard. I stood frozen in the corridor, my heart hammering relentlessly against my ribs, deeply unsettled by the realization that I was already completely entangled in Silas Thorne's gravity. My suite was nothing short of ridiculous. It was larger than my entire corporate office back in San Francisco, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive sunken living room, and a bathroom entirely constructed from black marble. But none of that captured my attention. What captured my attention was the heavy, polished mahogany door located on the far wall of the bedroom. An adjoining door. I walked over to it slowly, staring at the brass handle. I didn't need to guess where it led. It connected directly to Silas Thorne's master penthouse. I reached out and checked the lock. It was engaged from my side, but the mere knowledge that only an inch of wood separated my bed from the ice. Sovereign's territory made my stomach twist into a complicated knot of anxiety and something entirely foreign and dangerous. I forced myself to walk away, unpacking my suit and preparing for the evening. The Tokyo Global Innovations Summit Opening Gala was the premier networking event of the year. I had spent months preparing for this. I needed investors for my new eco-friendly battery technology. I could not let an accidental airplane nap and a few confusing elevator comments derail my entire company's future. By 8:30 p.m., I stepped into the massive, glittering grand ballroom of the hotel. The scale of the event was staggering. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over hundreds of the world's most powerful people. Waiters carrying trays of expensive champagne wove seamlessly through the crowds. The air was a cacophony of multiple languages, clinking glasses, and the subtle, underlying clash of various alpha pheromones competing for dominance in the room. I grabbed a glass of champagne, took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and waded into the Shark Tank. For the first hour, things went surprisingly well. I managed to speak with several key European investors, keeping my tone confident and my pitch flawless. I actively avoided looking toward the center of the room, where a massive crowd of eager executives had formed a tight circle. I didn't need to see the center to know who was holding court there. The faint, chilling scent of pine weaving through the ballroom was a constant reminder that Silas Thorne was present. I had just finished a promising conversation with a venture capitalist when a voice spoke directly behind my shoulder. Well, if it isn't the young prodigy of Vance Innovate. I turned around to find a tall, incredibly handsome man smiling at me. He had dark, perfectly styled hair, an expensive burgundy suit, and an aura of arrogant charm that was impossible to ignore. His pheromones hit me immediately, sharp black pepper and leather. A very strong, very classic alpha. Adrian Hayes. I recognized him instantly. He was the CEO of Apex Dynamics, one of the largest hardware manufacturers in the world. He was notorious for two things: aggressive corporate buyouts and an insatiable appetite for beautiful omegas. Julian Vance. Adrian stepped closer, his smile widening as he smoothly took my hand and shook it. His grip was a little too tight, a classic alpha dominance play. I kept my expression neutral and squeezed back with equal pressure. I read your latest quarterly report. Impressive growth for a startup. You have quite the brain in that pretty head of yours. I bristled slightly at the word pretty. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. We believe our new battery cells will revolutionize the market. Business, 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 Adrian chuckled, taking a sip of his whiskey and leaning against the high cocktail table we were standing next to. His dark eyes roamed over my face, lingering on my lips for a fraction of a second too long. You're much more interesting in person, Julian. Tell me, how does an alpha with such a delicate scent survive in Silicon Valley? You smell almost sweet enough to be an omega. My jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time an arrogant alpha had tried to belittle me using my pheromones, but it never failed to irritate me. My scent has never affected my profit margins, Mr. Hayes. But if you're so concerned with biology, perhaps you should be networking at a medical conference instead of a tech summit. Adrian threw his head back and laughed, genuinely amused. Sharp tongue. I like that. You know, Julian, I've been looking to invest in green energy. Perhaps we could discuss this further in a more private setting? My suite has a fantastic view of the Tokyo Tower. We could synergize our assets. He took another step closer, deliberately letting his heavy, peppery alpha pheromones flare to press against mine. It was a blatant, aggressive display of flirting, meant to back me into a corner. I opened my mouth to politely but firmly tell him to go to hell, but the words never left my throat. Because suddenly, the ambient temperature in our small corner of the ballroom plummeted. The sharp scent of black pepper was violently overwritten by the crushing, absolute zero cold of frozen pine. It hit the air like a physical shockwave. Adrian froze mid-smile. His entire body stiffened, his arrogant posture crumbling in a split second. I watched, wide-eyed, as a drop of nervous sweat materialized on his forehead. I didn't have to turn around to know who was standing directly behind me. Mr. Hayes. Silas Thorne's voice was softer than I had ever heard it, almost a whisper, yet it sliced through the noise of the ballroom like a scythe. Adrian swallowed hard, slowly turning his head. I turned with him. Silas was standing mere inches away from my back. His posture was completely relaxed, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He looked devastatingly handsome in a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly. But his eyes were terrifying. They were locked onto Adrian with the cold, lifeless intensity of an apex predator looking at an insect. The Enigma pheromones rolling off him were no longer tightly controlled. They were deliberately leaking into the air, an invisible, crushing weight of absolute dominance aimed entirely at the man flirting with me. "And Mr. Thorne," Adrian stammered, taking a hasty step back, instinctively creating distance from me. The confident, wealthy CEO from 5 seconds ago had completely vanished, replaced by a man whose biology was screaming at him to flee. "An honor to see you." "Is it?" Silas asked calmly, taking a slow sip from his glass. He didn't look at me, his gaze entirely focused on dismantling Adrian. "I was under the impression you were too busy attempting to poach my investments to notice your surroundings." Adrian paled. "Poach your investments?" "Sir, I was merely discussing green energy with Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance's company is currently in a highly delicate, exclusive observational phase with Thorne Global," Silas lied smoothly, his voice dropping another octave. The sheer authority in his tone made the lie sound like an irrefutable law of the universe. "Which makes him my direct concern. I do not appreciate other firms attempting to synergize with my assets, Hayes." The emphasis he placed on the word sent a violent, electric shock straight down my spine. It wasn't just corporate territorialism. The deep, rumbling growl hidden beneath his elegant tone was entirely, undeniably primal. Adrian looked like he wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. "I apologize, Mr. Thorne. I had no idea Vance Innovate was under your umbrella. I will step away immediately. Enjoy your evening, gentlemen." Adrian Hayes practically sprinted away, disappearing into the crowd faster than I could blink. The heavy, crushing pressure in the air instantly vanished as Silas effortlessly reeled his pheromones back in, restoring the atmosphere to a breathable state. He turned his head, finally looking down at me. The terrifying, cold predator in his eyes melted away, replaced by that same, quiet, unreadable focus that had trapped me in the elevator. I stared at him, my heart beating so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "I am not your asset," I said, my voice shaking slightly, though whether it was from anger or the lingering effect of his Enigma aura, I couldn't tell. "And my company is not in an observational phase with Thorne Global." Silas raised a single, dark eyebrow. He reached out, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to touch my face. Instead, his long fingers gently brushed against the lapel of my suit jacket, straightening a crease that didn't exist. "You were uncomfortable," Silas stated, as if it were the most simple, logical equation in the world. I removed the problem. "I could have handled him," I protested weakly, though the lingering heat from where his knuckles had brushed my chest was making it very difficult to formulate a coherent thought. "I am aware." Silas stepped closer, invading my personal space entirely. The scent of mint and pine wrapped around me, no longer crushing, but fiercely protective. But I preferred to handle him myself. "As I said earlier today, Julian." He leaned down slightly, his lips hovering dangerously close to my ear. "You are my rival. I don't share." End of part 2. Part 3. I don't share. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute. The deep, possessive rumble in Silas Thorne's voice vibrated directly through my chest, effectively shutting down every rational thought in my brain. My alpha instincts, which should have flared up in violent protest at being claimed like a piece of corporate property, remained completely, embarrassingly silent. Instead, a treacherous, foreign warmth spread through my stomach. I stepped back, physically breaking the magnetic pull of his proximity. My breathing was slightly uneven, and I desperately hoped the dim, golden lighting of the ballroom hid the furious blush I could feel burning on my cheeks. "I think," I started, my voice betraying a slight tremor that I violently willed away. "I think I have had enough champagne for one evening, Mr. Thorne. If you'll excuse me, I have a presentation to finalize for tomorrow." Silas did not try to stop me. He simply stood there, an immaculate statue of ice and power in his midnight blue tuxedo, holding his crystal glass. His gray eyes tracked my every movement. "Good night, Julian. Sleep well." His tone suggested he knew exactly how little sleep I was going to get. I turned and practically fled the ballroom. I didn't run, preserving the last shredded remnants of my professional dignity, but my strides were long and hurried. The moment the private glass elevator doors closed, shielding me from the rest of the summit, I leaned heavily against the cool glass, burying my face in my hands. "Get a grip, Julian," I muttered to the empty elevator. "He is a rival CEO. He is a ruthless enigma. He is literally known as the Ice Sovereign. You cannot let him manipulate your biology." But even as I said it, the phantom scent of frozen pine lingered on my clothes, a brand that Adrian Hayes and everyone else in that corner of the room had undoubtedly noticed. Silas hadn't just scared off an aggressive suitor. He had publicly marked my company, and by extension me, as his exclusive territory. When I finally reached my penthouse suite, the opulent luxury of the room offered no comfort. I threw my suit jacket onto the velvet armchair and aggressively loosened my tie. The silence of the massive room was deafening, broken only by the low, distant hum of the Tokyo traffic miles below. My eyes were immediately drawn to it. The heavy, polished mahogany door on the far side of the bedroom. The adjoining door. I walked over to it slowly, my bare feet sinking into the thick carpet. I stood in front of the wood, my heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against my ribs. It was locked from my side, a sturdy deadbolt keeping the boundary secure. But boundaries felt entirely theoretical when it came to Silas Thorne. I tentatively reached out, placing my palm flat against the cool wood. If I concentrated, if I let my senses stretch just a fraction, I could almost feel the chilling, overwhelming presence radiating from the other side. He was in there. The most dangerous man in the financial world was sleeping mere feet away from me. I pulled my hand back as if the wood had burned me. I forced myself to walk to my briefcase, pulling out my laptop and notes. I had a keynote presentation on eco-friendly battery cells at 10 a.m. I needed to focus. I needed to be brilliant. I spent the next 4 hours aggressively reviewing technical schematics and financial projections, violently redirecting my thoughts every time they drifted toward icy gray eyes and the feeling of a strong hand on my waist. By 3 a.m., sheer exhaustion finally overrode my anxiety, and I collapsed into the king-sized bed, falling into a restless sleep haunted by dreams of blizzards and dark, bespoke suits. The next morning, the Summit Auditorium was packed. Standing behind the podium on the massive, brightly lit stage, I looked out at a sea of over 2,000 industry professionals, investors, and journalists. The nervous energy humming in my veins was familiar and welcome. It sharpened my focus. This was my element. I wasn't just a flustered alpha dealing with an enigma. I was Julian Vance, a pioneer in green technology. I adjusted the microphone, taking a deep breath. Good morning. Today, we are not just talking about extending battery life. We are talking about redefining the fundamental architecture of sustainable energy storage. The first 15 minutes of my presentation were flawless. I clicked through the slides, my voice steady and commanding, breaking down complex chemical engineering into digestible, lucrative investment points. I could see the venture capitalists in the second row nodding approvingly. I was winning them over. And then the heavy, acoustic doors at the back of the auditorium opened. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a massive storm. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the rows of seated executives. Silas Thorne walked down the center aisle. He was dressed in a pristine, charcoal gray three-piece suit that screamed absolute authority. His expression was a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his eyes were fixed entirely on the stage. On me. My brain completely stalled for 3 agonizing seconds. The laser pointer in my hand trembled slightly. He wasn't supposed to be here. Thorne Global dealt in massive infrastructure and software networks. They had zero interest in startup green tech hardware. Yet here he was walking with that slow, predatory grace, descending the stairs until he reached the very front row. A terrified vice president from a European firm practically scrambled out of his seat to offer it to Silas. Silas accepted it with a curt nod, unbuttoning his jacket and sitting down directly in my line of sight. He crossed his long legs, steepled his fingers together, and looked up at me. Continue, his eyes commanded silently. I swallowed dryly, gripping the edges of the podium so hard my knuckles turned white. My alpha pride flared, a sudden, desperate need to prove myself rising above the panic. I would not let him intimidate me on my own stage. As demonstrated in our third quarter testing, I continued, forcing my voice to project confidently, entirely ignoring the front row. The thermal degradation is reduced by 40%. For the next 20 minutes, I delivered the best pitch of my entire life, fueled entirely by spite and the desperate need to keep Silas Thorne from seeing me sweat. When I finally concluded the presentation, the auditorium erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. I stepped off the stage, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. I had survived. Normally, after a successful keynote, a CEO is immediately swarmed by eager investors looking to schedule private meetings. I grabbed a bottle of water from the backstage table and walked out into the networking lobby, plastering a polite smile on my face, ready to hand out business cards. But something was wrong. The investors were looking at me, whispering among themselves, but no one was approaching. When I made eye contact with a prominent venture capitalist I had spoken to last night, the man offered a nervous, apologetic smile and quickly walked in the opposite direction. I frowned, confusion bleeding into frustration. Why was everyone avoiding me like I had a contagious disease? They are waiting for my permission. The voice came from behind me, low and smooth. I spun around. Silas was standing near a marble pillar, holding a cup of black coffee, looking infuriatingly relaxed. "What did you do?" I demanded, abandoning all pretenses of professional courtesy. I marched up to him, entirely ignoring the fact that my chest barely reached his collarbone. "Why is everyone avoiding me?" Silas looked down at me, his icy eyes tracing the furious flush on my face. "I simply made a few phone calls this morning, Julian. I informed the major investment firms that Thorne Global is conducting a highly confidential, exclusive audit of Vance Innovates technology. Anyone attempting to interfere with my acquisition process will be viewed as acting with hostile intent toward my empire." My jaw dropped. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man was staggering. "You did what? You have no right to do that. My company is not for sale, and we are certainly not in an exclusive audit with you. You just illegally sabotaged my entire funding round." "I did not sabotage anything," Silas replied calmly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I merely eliminated the useless middlemen. Your technology is brilliant, Julian. You presented it beautifully today." I was captivated. The sudden, genuine compliment threw me off balance, extinguishing half my anger before I could weaponize it. "I what?" "Your tech is revolutionary. Your investors are cowards who would have lowballed you," Silas continued, his voice dropping lower, pulling me entirely into his orbit. "I, on the other hand, do not lowball. I have already drafted a preliminary term sheet. I will fund your entire Series C, triple the amount you were asking for today." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the astronomical numbers he was implying. "Why? You don't even deal in green tech hardware." Silas stepped closer. The scent of frozen pine completely enveloped me, erasing the rest of the crowded lobby. The ambient noise of 100 executives networking faded into absolute silence. "Because Julian," Silas murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips before slowly rising back to my eyes. "I find that when I see something I want, I secure it immediately. And I am entirely tired of watching other alphas look at you." My breath hitched. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I thought it might crack the bone. This wasn't a corporate negotiation anymore. This was a hunt, and I was entirely cornered. "I am not signing away my company just because you have a territorial complex, Mr. Thorne," I managed to say, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "I am not asking for your company. I am asking for a partnership." Silas's lips curved into a very faint, very dangerous smile. "Read the term sheet. Dinner. Tonight. 8 o'clock. My suite." "I have prior engagements," I lied instantly, desperately needing to escape the suffocating intensity of his gravity. "Cancel them," Silas ordered softly. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly, almost agonizingly slowly, down the line of my jaw. My entire body shivered at the point of contact. "You have the adjoining door unlocked by 7:55 p.m., Julian, or I will unlock it for you." Before I could formulate a response, before I could push his hand away or scream in frustration, Silas turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the lobby, completely and utterly ruined. End of Part 3. Part 4. The term sheet sat on the center of my glass coffee table like a ticking explosive device. For the past 4 hours, I had done nothing but pace the length of my luxurious executive suite, occasionally stopping to glare at the pristine, heavy stock paper Thorne Global's legal team had couriered over exactly 20 minutes after I had fled the networking lobby. I had read the contract 6 times. I had run the numbers through my financial software, expecting to find the trap. A hostile takeover clause, a predatory equity demand, a hidden stipulation that would strip Vance Innovate of its patents. But there was nothing. The contract was bulletproof, shockingly generous, and entirely terrifying. Silas Thorne was offering to fund my entire Series C round, triple the valuation I had initially projected, while demanding only a minority, non-controlling stake in the company. It was the holy grail of investment offers. It was the kind of deal startup CEOs sold their souls for. And that was exactly the problem. Silas Thorne didn't do charity. The ICE sovereign didn't throw millions of dollars at green tech hardware purely out of the goodness of his heart. He was buying something else. Or rather, he was buying access to someone else. I find that when I see something I want, I secure it immediately. His low, rumbling voice echoed in my head, sending a treacherous shiver down my spine that I immediately tried to suppress with a surge of alpha indignation. I was a CEO, not a shiny new toy to be collected by a bored, overpowered enigma. I stopped pacing and checked my wristwatch. 7:42 p.m. My gaze drifted slowly to the heavy mahogany door connecting our suites. That would seem to mock me. You have the adjoining door unlocked by 7:55 p.m., Julian, or I will unlock it for you. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a promise of absolute, uncompromising dominance. He was testing my boundaries, seeing how much of my pride I was willing to swallow for the sake of my company. I marched into the black marble bathroom, turning on the cold water and splashing it fiercely against my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were slightly wide, my pupils dilated, a clear biological sign of stress induced by a superior predator's pheromones. I needed to regain control. I grabbed a towel, dried my face, and made a decision. I was going to this dinner. I was going to look him in the eye, negotiate the terms of the contract like the professional I was, and I was absolutely not going to let his enigma aura turn my brain to mush. I completely discarded my business suit. If this was a private dinner, I wasn't going to dress like one of his employees. I opted for a pair of tailored black slacks and a dark burgundy silk button-down shirt. I left the top 2 buttons undone, a subtle but deliberate act of defiance against the suffocating corporate rigidity Silas usually demanded. I applied a sharp, spicy cologne, black pepper and bergamot, specifically designed to mask my naturally soft, sweet cedar scent. I wanted to project strength, not vulnerability. At 7:54 p.m., I stood in front of the adjoining door. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited, watching the second hand on my watch sweep across the dial. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. At exactly 7:55 p.m., I reached forward, grasped the heavy brass deadbolt, and twisted it with a loud, echoing click. I took a step back, my muscles tense, waiting for the handle to turn from the other side. I waited for Silas to push the door open and invade my space. But nothing happened. The door remained perfectly still. The silence stretched for a full minute, heavy and loaded with unspoken challenges. Slowly, the realization dawned on me. He wasn't going to open it. Unlocking the door was my submission to his demand. Opening it and crossing the threshold was my acceptance of his invitation. He was making me come to him. Arrogant bastard. I muttered under my breath, my irritation briefly overriding my anxiety. I grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The transition from my suite to his was like stepping onto a different planet. While my room was bright and modern, Silas's penthouse was vast, dimly lit, and dripping with an oppressive, dark luxury. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the glittering Tokyo skyline at night. In the center of the massive room, near the glass, a private dining table was set for 2, complete with fine china, crystal wine glasses, and a dimly burning centerpiece. But my eyes didn't linger on the view or the table. They instantly locked onto the man standing by a sleek, black marble wet bar. Silas Thorne had shed his immaculate 3-piece suit. He was wearing a pair of dark trousers and a crisp black dress shirt. The collar was open, exposing the strong line of his throat, and the sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing thick, corded forearms and an obscenely expensive silver watch. The casual state of his dress was somehow 10 times more intimidating than his armor-like business suits. It stripped away the ICE Sovereign CEO persona and left only the raw, undeniable enigma underneath. He was pouring a dark red wine into 2 crystal glasses. He didn't look up as I entered, but the sudden, deliberate shift in the air pressure told me he knew exactly where I was standing. The scent of frozen pine drifted across the room, wrapping around me instantly, effortlessly cutting through my spicy, defensive cologne like a knife through silk. "You're exactly on time, Julian," Silas said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that filled the massive room. He picked up the 2 glasses and finally turned to face me. His striking gray eyes swept over my burgundy shirt, lingering for a fraction of a second on the exposed skin at my collarbone. A very faint, entirely dangerous spark ignited in his gaze. And you left your tie next door. I approve. I forced my feet to move, stepping fully into his territory and letting the adjoining door click shut behind me. I am here to discuss the term sheet, Mr. Thorne. I figured formal attire was unnecessary for a hostile negotiation. Silas chuckled, a low, rich sound that I had never heard before. It did catastrophic things to my pulse. Hostile? I offer you triple your valuation and single-handedly secure your company's future, and you call it hostile. He walked toward me, moving with that agonizingly slow, predatory grace. He stopped a mere foot away, holding out one of the crystal glasses. I took it, being extremely careful not to let our fingers brush. You sabotaged my networking opportunities, terrified half the investors at the summit, and essentially held me hostage by demanding I leave my door unlocked. Yes, Silas, I would classify that as slightly hostile. I used his first name deliberately, pushing back against his dominance. Silas didn't blink. He simply took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving mine. I eliminated distractions. Those investors would have wasted your time for months, demanding board seats and creative control. They would have suffocated your vision. I am giving you the capital to build whatever you want, entirely unhindered. And what do you get in return? I challenged, gripping the stem of my wine glass tightly. Thorne Global doesn't need my battery tech. This deal makes no logical sense for your portfolio. So what is the actual price, Silas? What aren't you putting on the paper? Silas lowered his glass. The playful, amused glint in his eyes vanished, replaced by an intensity so deep and terrifyingly focused it made my breath hitch. He took a half-step closer. The physical distance between us was now practically non-existent. I had to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. I don't put everything on paper, Julian, he murmured softly. Suddenly, the crushing, icy pressure of his Enigma pheromones shifted. It didn't disappear, but it transformed. Instead of the aggressive, suffocating frost that demanded submission, it became a heavy, enveloping blanket of cool pine and deep earth. It was purposefully, terrifyingly soothing. My alpha biology, which had been fighting a frantic, defensive war since I entered the room, suddenly let out a massive sigh of relief. The tension in my shoulders melted. My heart rate, previously hammering in panic, began to slow into a deep, rhythmic thud. It was a biological hack. He was weaponizing his Enigma nature to completely disarm my stress. Stop doing that, I whispered, though my voice lacked any real venom. Doing what? Silas asked innocently, though the corner of his mouth twitched. Manipulating the air. You're artificially calming me down. You were anxious. You walked into my suite radiating defensive pepper and fear. Silas lifted his free hand. He didn't touch me, but his fingers hovered mere inches from my cheek, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I prefer you when you are grounded. Your natural scent, the cedar and the rain, it is much more suited to you than that terrible cologne you bathed in tonight. My face flushed violently. He had seen right through my armor. The term sheet is generous because your mind is brilliant, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a hypnotic register. I want Vance Innovate to succeed. But more importantly, I want a reason to keep you in my orbit. If I simply handed you a check and walked away, you would bury yourself in your laboratory in San Francisco and actively avoid my calls. You are incredibly stubborn. I am a CEO. I shot back, though I was struggling to keep my train of thought on the business tracks. I protect my company. And I protect what is mine, Silas stated flawlessly. I am not yours. Not yet, he agreed smoothly, dropping his hand and taking a step back, instantly releasing me from the hypnotic trap of his immediate proximity. The sudden loss of his body heat left me feeling strangely, infuriatingly cold. Dinner is getting cold, Julian. Let us sit. We can debate the parameters of your independence over the Wagyu. I stared at his broad back as he walked toward the table, feeling completely outmaneuvered. I had walked into this room preparing for a corporate war, armed with financial statistics and legal rebuttals. Silas Thorne wasn't playing that game. He was playing an entirely different game, one of biology, power, and an undeniable magnetic attraction that I was rapidly losing the strength to fight. I walked over to the table and took the seat opposite him. The Tokyo skyline glittered through the glass beside us, a million distant lights that felt entirely insignificant compared to the storm sitting across from me. For the first 20 minutes, we actually talked business. Silas's mind was a terrifyingly sharp instrument. He asked piercing, brilliant questions about my supply chain, chemical degradation rates, and long-term scaling logistics. I found myself matching his intellect, firing back answers, genuinely enjoying the sheer mental exercise of speaking with someone who could keep up with my vision. For a brief, shining moment, we were just two industry leaders discussing the future. But Silas was an enigma, and he never let me forget it for long. As I was passionately explaining the environmental impact of lithium alternatives, I reached across the table to gesture toward the term sheet. Silas's hand moved with lightning speed. Before I could retract my arm, his long, strong fingers wrapped around my wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. An iron shackle wrapped in velvet. The words died in my throat. I looked down at his hand encircling my wrist, the stark contrast of his pale skin against my burgundy sleeve, and then up into his icy gray eyes. "You're very passionate when you talk about your work," Silas said quietly, his thumb slowly, deliberately dragging across the erratic, racing pulse point on the inside of my wrist. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity straight up my arm and directly into my chest. My breath hitched audibly. I tried to pull my hand back, a weak, instinctual tug, but he held firm, anchoring me to him across the table. "Silas." I breathed out the formal Mr. Thorne entirely forgotten. "Your heart is racing, Julian," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips. His enigma pheromones spiked, thick and intoxicating, flooding my senses until I could barely think. He leaned forward slightly, the elegant dining table the only thing separating us. "Tell me the truth. Is your pulse racing because of the contract? Or is it because of me?" End of part 4. Part 5. Is your pulse racing because of the contract? Or is it because of me? The question hung over the dining table, a heavy, suffocating weight that completely paralyzed my vocal cords. Silas didn't move. His thumb continued its agonizingly slow, deliberate stroke across the erratic, frantic beating of my pulse point. It was a microscopic movement, yet it felt like it was echoing through every single nerve ending in my body. I was an alpha. I was biologically hardwired to fiercely protect my personal space, to aggressively reject any attempt at physical dominance from a rival. Yet, as I sat there pinned under the weight of his icy gray gaze, my primal instincts were completely betraying me. I didn't want to pull my hand away. I wanted him to pull me across the table. The contract. I finally managed to choke out, though my voice was a breathless, unconvincing whisper that completely destroyed the lie. "It's a very large sum of money, Silas. It would make anyone's heart race." Silas's lips curved into a slow, devastatingly handsome smirk. The enigma pheromones rolling off him shifted again, the chilling frost melting into something darker, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. It smelled like a forest right before a massive thunderstorm. "You are a brilliant engineer, Julian," Silas murmured, his grip on my wrist tightening just a fraction of an inch, enough to remind me of his sheer physical strength, but gentle enough not to bruise. "You have built an empire from scratch. You can calculate complex thermal degradation rates in your head. And yet, you are a spectacularly terrible liar." He leaned closer, the ambient light of the Tokyo skyline reflecting in the depths of his eyes. "Your pupils are dilated. Your breathing is shallow. And underneath that dreadful pepper cologne you drowned yourself in, your natural scent is spiking. You smell like rain and sweet cedar. You smell, entirely captivated." Heat exploded across my cheeks, a violent, humiliating flush that I knew he could see perfectly in the dim lighting. He was completely dismantling my defenses, stripping away the CEO armor I had carefully constructed and addressing the biological reality of what was happening between us. I gathered the last remaining shreds of my dignity. I forced my hand back, pulling my wrist out of his grasp. The sudden loss of his touch was a physical shock, leaving my skin feeling cold and strangely empty. "I am captivated by the sheer audacity of your negotiation tactics, Mr. Thorne," I retorted, desperately trying to inject some venom back into my tone as I reached for my wine glass with a slightly trembling hand. "I am not one of your corporate acquisitions. You cannot simply manipulate my nervous system into signing a term sheet." Silas didn't look offended. If anything, my resistance seemed to amuse him further. He leaned back in his chair, seamlessly transitioning from the predatory enigma back to the untouchable billionaire CEO in the blink of an eye. The psychological whiplash was staggering. "I have no intention of manipulating your signature, Julian," Silas said smoothly, picking up his own glass and taking a slow sip. "If I wanted to force you, I would have bought out your current investors yesterday and launched a hostile takeover before you even landed in Tokyo. I am giving you a choice. A highly lucrative, entirely voluntary choice. A choice with conditions," I pointed out, my heart rate finally beginning to decelerate to a somewhat normal rhythm. "There are always conditions," he he replied effortlessly. My condition is simple. I fund your vision, and you stop running from me. We work together. Exclusively. No more Adrian Hayes. No more European venture capitalists attempting to buy your time. Your company falls under the protection of Thorn Global, and by extension, so do you. The rest of the dinner passed in a state of highly charged, terrifyingly civilized tension. Silas proved to be an impeccable host. He seamlessly directed the conversation back to the global energy markets, allowing me to regain my professional footing. We debated tariff regulations, supply chain shortages, and the future of sustainable infrastructure. It was intoxicating. I had never met anyone who could match my intellectual pace so effortlessly, who challenged my theories with such sharp, clinical precision. He listened to me. He didn't patronize me, didn't talk over me like so many other older alphas in the industry did. He respected my mind, even as his eyes continually dropped to my lips, silently reminding me that his interest was far from purely academic. When the waiter eventually arrived to clear the plates, the clock on the wall read nearly midnight. I had been in his penthouse for 4 hours, and it had felt like 15 minutes. Silas stood up from the table, his imposing height instantly commanding the room once again. He walked over to the glass coffee table, picked up the pristine leather folder containing the term sheet, and held it out to me. "Take it," Silas commanded softly. I stood up, crossing the room, and took the folder from his hands. Our knuckles brushed, a brief, electrifying contact that sent another treacherous shiver down my spine. "Read it again," Silas said, his gaze locking onto mine. He stepped closer, crowding my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. "Look for the traps you are so convinced I have set. Run it past your legal team in San Francisco if you must. But I want your signature on the bottom line by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The scent of frozen pine was wrapping around me like a heavy blanket, making my knees feel dangerously weak. Silas reached out, his hand gently grasping the back of my neck. His long fingers slid into the short hair at the nape of my neck, a possessive, grounding touch that made a soft, entirely involuntary sound escape my throat. "If you refuse," Silas murmured, his thumb brushing against my jawline, "I will respect your decision as a CEO. I will not pursue Vance Innovate's assets." He paused, his eyes darkening to the color of a stormy sea. "But I will absolutely pursue you, Julian. And without the convenient excuse of a corporate partnership to hide behind, I assure you, my methods will be significantly more direct." My breath hitched violently. It was a promise of total destruction. If I didn't give him my company, he was going to strip away the business pretense and hunt me purely as a man, as an enigma claiming an alpha. He released my neck, the absence of his heat leaving me dizzy. "Good night, Julian. Leave the adjoining door unlocked." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I turned on my heel, clutching the leather folder to my chest like a physical shield, and walked back through the heavy mahogany door. The moment I was safely inside my own suite, I pushed the door shut, leaning my back heavily against the wood, gasping for air as if I had just surfaced from drowning. I was completely and utterly ruined. The next 3 hours were a blur of manic, exhausted pacing. I stripped off my clothes, threw on a hotel bathrobe, and sat cross-legged on the center of my king-sized bed, staring at the term sheet. I read every single clause. I read the fine print. I analyzed the equity split, the voting rights, the board seat allocations. It was perfect. It was the contract I had dreamed of since I founded the company in my tiny apartment 5 years ago. It guaranteed my employees jobs, it funded our research for the next decade, and it kept the creative control entirely in my hands. Silas hadn't lied. There were no traps. The only price was my proximity to him. At 2 a.m., the massive Tokyo skyline outside my window was quiet, a sea of silent, glowing neon. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen sitting on the nightstand. My hand was shaking slightly. By signing this, I was officially tethering my life, my life's work, and my future to the Ice Sovereign. I was stepping willingly into the gravity of a man who could crush me with a single thought. I pressed the pen to the thick paper. I signed my name, Julian Vance. I stared at the wet ink for a long time. The feeling of relief that washed over me was profound, but it was immediately followed by a restless, burning energy that refused to let me sleep. I looked across the room at the adjoining door. It was closed, but per his instruction, I hadn't locked the deadbolt. I could wait until 8 a.m. I could put on a suit, walk into the hallway, knock on his main door, and hand over the contract like a proper, civilized business partner. That was the rational, safe thing to do. But as I stared at the wood, I realized I didn't want to be safe. I was tired of fighting the overwhelming, magnetic pull that had possessed me since the moment I woke up on his shoulder on that airplane. I stood up from the bed. I didn't bother changing out of the plush, white hotel bathrobe. I picked up the signed contract, my bare feet sinking into the carpet as I walked slowly toward the boundary between our rooms. I didn't knock. I grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and pushed the door open. The penthouse was almost entirely dark, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the city lights pouring through the massive windows. For a terrifying second, I thought he was asleep, and I had just made a monumental fool of myself. Then, a voice drifted from the far corner of the room. "I told you 8 o'clock, Julian." I turned my head. Silas was sitting in a deep leather armchair facing the windows, a glass of amber liquid resting in his hand. He hadn't changed clothes, though his shirt was unbuttoned further down his chest. Even in the shadows, his presence was an absolute, physical force. I swallowed hard, my grip on the leather folder tightening. I stepped fully into his room, letting the door click shut behind me. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet space. "I finished reading it," I said, my voice surprisingly steady in the darkness. Silas slowly turned his head, his piercing eyes locking onto me. He took in the sight of me standing in his territory at 2 in the morning, wearing nothing but a bathrobe, clutching his contract. The heavy, intoxicating scent of his pheromones flared instantly, filling the room with a thick, possessive warmth. He set his glass down on the side table with a soft clink. He stood up, slowly closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me, looking down at me with an intensity that made my very soul vibrate. "And," Silas murmured, his voice a dark, velvet rumble. I lifted my chin, staring directly into the eyes of the most terrifying enigma in the world, and handed him the folder. "I signed it," I whispered. Silas didn't look at the paper. He took the folder from my hands and casually tossed it onto a nearby table, completely discarding the multi-million-dollar agreement. His hands moved instantly, wrapping around my waist, pulling my body flush against his hard, unyielding frame. "Good," Silas breathed, his eyes darkening as he lowered his head, his lips hovering mere millimeters from mine. "Because business hours are officially over." End of Part 5. Part 6. Because business hours are officially over. The words had barely left Silas's lips before his mouth crashed down onto mine. There was no hesitation, no gentle leading, and absolutely no room for negotiation. It was a total, consuming eclipse of my senses. The taste of expensive, smoky whiskey on his tongue mixed violently with the intoxicating, crushing wave of frozen pine and dark earth pheromones. My brain completely short-circuited. For a fraction of a second, the deep-rooted alpha biology inside me flared, a desperate, instinctual panic against being physically dominated. I brought my hands up, pressing them flat against his solid chest, intending to push back. But the moment my palms felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart beneath his shirt, the fight entirely drained out of me. Silas's hands were possessive and unforgiving. One arm remained locked around my waist, keeping my body pinned flush against his, while his other hand slid up into my hair, tilting my head back to deepen the kiss. I gasped, my lips parting willingly for him, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated deep in Silas's chest. The sound sent a shockwave of pure electricity straight to my core. My hands, which had been resting defensively on his chest, betrayed me completely. My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, clinging to him as my knees went dangerously weak. The ice sovereign was entirely gone. In the dark, quiet isolation of the Tokyo penthouse, Silas Thorne was nothing but a primal enigma claiming what he had decided was his. He walked me backward, his mouth never leaving mine, until the back of my knees hit the edge of the plush, king-sized bed in the center of the room. The sudden obstacle broke our kiss, but only for a second. I collapsed backward onto the mattress, the thick white hotel bathrobe falling open slightly, exposing my chest to the cool air of the room. Silas followed me down instantly, his large frame hovering over mine, caging me in. The ambient city light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast sharp shadows across his face, making his icy gray eyes look impossibly dark and completely feral. "Julian," he whispered, my name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below my jaw. "You have no idea how much self-control it took to let you walk out of my sight today. You didn't let me out of your sight." I managed to gasp out, my fingers tangling in the dark, slightly disheveled hair at the nape of his neck. "You sabotaged half the summit to keep me in a corner." "And I would do it again," Silas murmured, his open mouth tracing the line of my throat. Every place his lips touched left a trail of scorching heat that violently contrasted with his freezing Enigma scent. I would buy the entire summit if it meant I could keep you looking at me exactly like this. He inhaled deeply, burying his face in the crook of my neck, right over my scent gland. The sheer intimacy of the gesture made my breath hitch. In our world, the scent gland was a deeply vulnerable, highly protected area. To expose it to another, especially an Enigma, was the ultimate sign of submission. I didn't try to hide it. I tilted my head to the side, baring my throat to him completely. Cedar and rain, Silas breathed against my skin, his voice thick with a heavy, intoxicating reverence. You are perfect. And then I felt it. The scrape of his teeth against the sensitive skin of my pulse point. My eyes widened in the dark. He was going to mark me. A temporary scent claim was one thing, leaving a lingering smell of pine on my clothes to ward off other alphas. But a physical bite, a true mark, would infuse his Enigma biology directly into my bloodstream. It was a declaration of absolute ownership that the entire corporate world would be able to smell on me for weeks. Silas, I gasped, my hands gripping his shoulders tightly. Mine, he growled, the word vibrating directly against my skin. He bit down. A sharp, stinging pinch pierced my neck, immediately followed by a massive, overwhelming flood of Enigma pheromones rushing into my system. It wasn't cold anymore. It was a blazing, blinding heat that swept through my veins, wiping away every ounce of stress, anxiety, and fear I had carried for the past 5 years of building my company. I cried out softly, my back arching off the mattress as the intense rush of his claim settled deep into my bones. The heavy, grounding weight of his presence wrapped around my soul like an iron shield. I was tethered to him. The ruthless, terrifying CEO who could make billionaires tremble had just anchored himself to me. Silas slowly pulled back, his tongue soothing the fresh, stinging mark he had just left. He propped himself up on his forearms, looking down at me with an expression so fiercely protective and incredibly soft that it made my heart physically ache. I care about you, Julian, Silas whispered, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. The absolute sincerity in his eyes stripped away all his armor. I will protect your vision. I will protect your company. And I will protect you. I looked up at him, my breathing finally starting to slow, my entire body humming with the heavy, comforting scent of frozen pine that now permanently intertwined with my own. I know, I whispered back, pulling his face down to mine for another kiss. I know. The rest of the night faded into a haze of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, and the surreal, overwhelming reality of being entirely consumed by the man I had once thought was my greatest threat. When consciousness slowly crawled back into my body the next morning, there was no airplane turbulence, no agonizing stiffness in my neck, and no blind panic. There was only a deep, steady warmth wrapped securely around my waist. I blinked my eyes open, sunlight streaming brightly through the massive penthouse windows. I was curled on my side, my back pressed flush against Silas's solid chest. His arm was draped heavily over me, his hand resting possessively flat against my stomach. I shifted slightly, and the movement caused a dull, throbbing ache at the base of my neck. My hand flew up, my fingers brushing against the raised, tender skin of the bite mark. The memory of last night rushed back in vivid, scorching detail, sending a fresh wave of heat to my cheeks. Good morning. Silas's voice was a low, raspy rumble against my ear, thick with sleep. I turned my head over my shoulder. He was already awake, his gray eyes watching me with a calm, contented expression that looked entirely foreign on his usually stoic face. You're staring, I mumbled, suddenly feeling incredibly shy in the harsh light of day. I am admiring my investment, Silas replied effortlessly, a faint, devastating smirk playing on his lips. He leaned forward, pressing a soft, lingering kiss directly over the fresh mark on my neck. The contact sent a shiver straight down my spine, and ensuring my seal is intact. You are incredibly arrogant before coffee, I retorted, though I leaned back into his touch, completely failing to sound annoyed. And you are attempting to deflect because you are blushing, Mr. Vance. It is a very endearing trait. Silas finally untangled himself from me, sitting up and stretching his broad shoulders. Get dressed, Julian. We have a summit to conquer. An hour later, I stood in front of the black marble vanity mirror, staring at my reflection. I was wearing a sharp, light gray suit, my hair perfectly styled. But no matter how professional I looked, there was no hiding the massive, unmistakable shift in my biology. The bite mark was hidden beneath the crisp collar of my shirt, but the scent was impossible to mask. I no longer smelled like mild cedar and rain. I smelled like Julian Vance and Silas Thorne. The heavy, warning scent of an enigma clung to me like a bespoke suit of armor. Every alpha within a 50-foot radius was going to know exactly who I belonged to. I took a deep breath, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out into the main penthouse living room. Silas was waiting by the door, dressed in a sleek, black suit that made him look every inch the terrifying corporate predator the world knew him as. But when he looked at me, his eyes softened just a fraction. He held out his hand. I didn't hesitate. I walked over and slipped my hand into his, our fingers intertwining naturally. The moment the private elevator doors opened into the massive, crowded networking lobby of the hotel, the atmosphere shifted so violently it was almost comical. We walked out together, side by side. I deliberately maintained a professional half-step of distance, but the invisible tether between us was practically vibrating in the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Dozens of heads turned in our direction. I could literally see the exact moment the surrounding executives caught the scent radiating off me. Eyes widened in shock. Coffee cups were slowly lowered, and a wave of stunned, terrified whispers immediately swept through the lobby like a wildfire touching dry grass. Is that Vance? Good God, his scent. Did Thorne mark him? An alpha? I thought that was a myth. I heard Thorne rejected 3 massive European syndicates yesterday. Is this why? He's favoring the startup CEO. The rumor mill was operating at maximum velocity. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, channeling every ounce of CEO composure I possessed, but internally, my stomach was twisting. I hated being the center of gossip. I hated the implication that my success was now going to be attributed to nepotism or bedroom politics rather than my technology. I slowed my pace slightly, a frown beginning to form on my lips. Silas noticed instantly. He didn't look at me, but his pace slowed to match mine. His jaw clenched, a dangerous, icy glint flashing in his eyes as he surveyed the whispering crowd of businessmen. When Silas Thorne stopped moving entirely in the middle of a crowded room, the world stopped with him. The whispers died instantly. The silence that fell over the lobby was absolute and terrifying. Silas slowly turned his body, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over a group of prominent venture capitalists who had been gossiping the loudest. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. If anyone in this room is currently concerned about the nature of my recent negotiations or investment rejections, Silas stated, his voice a lethal, frozen calm that carried effortlessly across the massive marble hall, allow me to clarify the reality of the situation. Nobody breathed. The executives looked like deer caught in the headlights of a speeding train. Thorne Global has officially partnered with Vance Innovate, Silas continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with razor-sharp authority. Not out of favoritism, but because Mr. Vance's technology is vastly superior to anything else currently on this floor. If certain parties are dissatisfied with their own inadequacies and lost capital, they are free to pursue partnerships elsewhere. However, Silas paused, letting the heavy, crushing weight of his Enigma pheromones roll over the room like a physical warning. Anyone caught spreading baseless, disrespectful fiction regarding my partner will find themselves permanently blacklisted from every market Thorne Global operates in. Do I make myself perfectly clear? A terrified, collective murmur of agreement rippled through the executives. Several men practically bowed their heads in submission to the overwhelming Enigma aura. Silas didn't wait for further confirmation. He seamlessly slipped his hand into the pocket of his trousers, turned his head toward me, and the terrifying predator vanished, replaced by a calm, collected businessman. "Shall we proceed to the first panel, Julian?" he asked smoothly. I stared at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of absolute awe and deep, undeniable affection. He hadn't just defended me. He had publicly validated my work and threatened the entire global market into respecting me. "Lead the way, Silas," I replied, a genuine, confident smile finally breaking across my face as we walked together into the lion's den. End of Part 6. Part 7. The atmosphere inside the Grand Conference Hall for the final panel was electric, thick with a tension that hadn't been there the previous day. As I took my seat on the stage alongside 3 other leading tech CEOs, I could feel the collective weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on me. I was no longer just the young, ambitious founder of Vance Innovate. I was the alpha who had somehow managed to tame the Ice Sovereign. I was the Enigma's chosen partner. The heavy, lingering scent of Silas's frozen pine radiating from my skin was a constant, undeniable broadcast of his claim over me. Every time I shifted in my leather chair, the collar of my suit brushed against the tender, hidden bite mark on my neck, sending a small jolt of heat straight to my core. It was distracting, terrifying, and incredibly empowering all at once. Silas, true to his nature, had claimed the center seat in the very front row. He sat with his long legs crossed, his posture radiating a relaxed, untouchable authority. His icy gray eyes never left my face, anchoring me amidst the sea of murmuring investors and flashing press cameras. The first 40 minutes of the panel proceeded smoothly. We discussed the integration of sustainable energy grids into smart cities. I spoke confidently, my voice steady, entirely in my element. The other panelists, seasoned alphas in their 50s, were visibly cautious around me, their usual aggressive posturing completely neutralized by the heavy Enigma warning clinging to my pheromones. Then came the open Q&A session. A tall, sharp-featured venture capitalist stepped up to the center microphone. I recognized him instantly, Marcus Sterling, a notoriously ruthless shark who had practically laughed me out of his San Francisco office 3 years ago when I first sought seed funding. "Mr. Vance," Sterling began, his voice dripping with thinly veiled skepticism, "while your thermal degradation metrics are certainly creative, I have to ask about scalability. It's one thing to build a prototype in a lab, and quite another to manufacture on a global scale. Given that your company just miraculously secured the backing of Thorn Global, a conglomerate with zero history in green hardware, many are wondering if this partnership is a strategic business move or simply an incredibly expensive, personal bailout for a startup that was secretly sinking." The entire hall fell dead silent. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Several executives practically cringed, turning to look at Silas in the front row, expecting the Enigma to stand up and verbally decimate the man. I looked at Silas. His eyes were dark, a storm brewing in his irises, and his jaw was set like granite. I knew he was half a second away from destroying Marcus Sterling's entire career. I gave Silas a microscopic shake of my head. "Let me handle this." I leaned forward, adjusting my microphone, and let my own alpha pheromones flare just enough to cut through the tension. "I appreciate your concern for my company's buoyancy, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice ringing out clear and cold across the massive auditorium. "However, if you had thoroughly reviewed our publicly available Q2 manufacturing reports instead of focusing on lobby gossip, you would know that Vance Innovate has already secured 3 independent manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia. Our scalability is not theoretical. It is actively in motion." Sterling opened his mouth to interrupt, but I didn't let him. "Furthermore," I continued, my gaze locking onto him with absolute, unwavering dominance, "Thorn Global's infrastructure software is the most advanced in the world. By integrating their AI grid management with our physical battery cells, we are not just scaling production. We are creating the first fully autonomous, self-regulating energy network on the planet. This is not a bailout. This is a monopoly in the making. And the fact that you failed to see the synergy of this acquisition only confirms why I declined to seek your firm's capital for our Series C." The silence in the room stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. And then a slow, deep, echoing sound filled the space. It was applause. Silas Thorn was slowly clapping, his hands coming together in a rhythmic, deliberate tempo. A devastatingly proud, genuinely lethal smirk had broken across his face. Within seconds, the rest of the auditorium joined in, the applause swelling into a deafening roar. Sterling turned completely pale, stepping away from the microphone and practically shrinking back into the crowd. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing with pure adrenaline, and met Silas's eyes. The look of absolute, burning reverence he gave me sent a shiver straight down my spine. In that moment, I wasn't just a prize he had claimed, I was a partner he deeply respected. By the time the summit officially concluded later that evening, the adrenaline had completely burned off, leaving me profoundly exhausted. The past 4 days felt like a decade. I had walked into Tokyo as an independent, solitary CEO, and I was leaving it irrevocably tethered to an enigma. As we stepped out of the Grand Hotel, the cool night air brushed against my face. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce was idling at the curb, its driver standing perfectly at attention. "I am officially drained," I admitted quietly, rubbing the back of my neck as we walked toward the car. "The thought of a 13-hour commercial flight back to San Francisco is currently my personal definition of hell." "You are not flying commercial, Julian," Silas said smoothly, placing a warm hand on the small of my back to guide me into the luxurious leather interior of the car. "My jet is waiting at Narita. We are flying back together." I slumped into the soft leather seats, too tired to argue, and frankly, too relieved that I didn't have to part ways with him just yet. "Does Thorn Global even have headquarters in San Francisco? I thought you were based in Seattle." Silas slid in beside me, the heavy door closing with a solid thud, sealing us in the quiet intimacy of the cabin. "I have offices globally. But starting tomorrow, I am restructuring my schedule. I will be operating primarily out of my San Francisco branch for the foreseeable future. I turned my head to look at him, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. You're moving your base of operations for me? I told you, Julian. I do not share, and I do not tolerate distance when it comes to what is mine, Silas murmured, reaching over to pull me flush against his side. Get some rest. We have a long flight ahead of us. Stepping onto the Thorn Global Private jet an hour later felt like a surreal parallel to the beginning of this chaotic trip. The aircraft was a flying palace, dark mahogany paneling, plush cream leather seats, and a fully stocked wet bar. It was a stark contrast to the first-class pod where our nightmare, and our story, had begun. Once we reached cruising altitude, the quiet hum of the engines providing a soothing white noise, Silas poured us 2 glasses of aged bourbon. He discarded his suit jacket and loosened his tie, sitting down on the expansive leather sofa in the center of the cabin. I walked over, kicking off my shoes, and sat down next to him. I didn't hesitate. I didn't overthink my alpha pride or the rigid rules of corporate decorum. I simply let out a long sigh, leaned sideways, and rested my head heavily against Silas's broad shoulder. Silas immediately shifted his arm, wrapping it securely around me and pulling me closer. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, his Enigma pheromones wrapping around me like a warm, protective blanket. Comfortable? He asked, his voice a low, teasing rumble. You have a much better posture this time around. I chuckled softly against his chest. I was exhausted then. I'm exhausted now. The only difference is that now, I actually know you're not going to push me out of the emergency exit. I would never let you fall, Julian, Silas said quietly, the teasing edge vanishing from his voice, replaced by absolute sincerity. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the dark clouds drift past the small oval windows. The bourbon warmed my chest, but it was the steady, rhythmic beating of Silas's heart beneath my cheek that truly grounded me. You know, I said softly, the quiet intimacy of the cabin pulling the words from my chest. We've spent this entire week negotiating deals, fighting off investors, and arguing about corporate boundaries. But you barely know anything about my actual life. The life outside the boardroom. Silas's fingers gently trailed up and down my arm. Then tell me. I want to know everything. I exhaled slowly, my gaze fixing on the amber liquid in my glass. I wasn't born into this world. My parents were public school teachers. We didn't have trust funds or connections. When I had the idea for the battery cells, I built the first prototype in our cramped garage. Silas listened in absolute silence, giving me his complete, undivided attention. After I graduated, getting anyone to take a 22-year-old seriously was impossible. I continued, a small, nostalgic smile touching my lips. I got rejected by 40 different firms. It broke my confidence. But my dad, he used to dress up in his best, slightly worn-out suit, and he would walk with me from bank to bank in the financial district. He'd stand right beside me, holding my schematics, and practically beg loan officers to just give me 5 minutes to pitch. The memory made my chest tighten, a familiar, heavy ache settling in my ribs. He was an alpha too, I whispered. And in our world, begging is the ultimate humiliation. But he swallowed his pride every single day because he believed in my mind more than he cared about his own ego. Silas's arm tightened around me, pulling me impossibly closer. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply provided a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He passed away a few months before we secured our first real angel investment. I finished, my voice thick. He never got to see Vance Innovate become a reality. He never saw the San Francisco office. Julian, Silas murmured softly, his hand reaching up to gently cup my jaw, turning my face to look at him. His icy gray eyes were incredibly soft, filled with a depth of empathy I hadn't known the Ice Sovereign was capable of. He gave you the foundation to become the most brilliant man I have ever met. He would be unspeakably proud of the empire you've built. I swallowed the lump in my throat, leaning into the warmth of his palm. My mom still lives in our old house in the suburbs. I try to visit her every Sunday. She keeps me grounded when the corporate world gets too loud. Silas studied my face for a long moment, his thumb lightly stroking my cheekbone. I would like to meet her. My eyes widened in surprise. You want to meet my mother? If you will permit it, Silas said, his tone carrying a quiet, vulnerable earnestness. I don't just want the CEO of Vance Innovate, Julian. I want you. All of you. And that means understanding the people who made you who you are. My heart did a violent, beautiful flip inside my chest. This wasn't a corporate takeover. This wasn't an enigma claiming a prize. This was a man asking to be a permanent, deeply rooted part of my life. I smiled, a genuine, blinding smile that reached all the way to my eyes. She makes a terrible casserole, Silas. And she will absolutely interrogate you about your intentions. I have survived hostile boardrooms and European syndicates, Silas replied smoothly, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to my lips. I believe I can handle a casserole, and my intentions are entirely, permanently clear. I closed my eyes, letting the heavy, sweet scent of cedar and frozen pine mix perfectly in the small cabin. For the first time in my life, looking toward the future didn't fill me with the anxious dread of the next board meeting or stock projection. It filled me with the quiet, overwhelming peace of finally coming home. End of Part 7. Part 8. The sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce looked entirely alien parked in the driveway of the modest, two-story suburban home in San Mateo. I sat in the passenger seat, staring through the tinted window at the chipped white paint of the front porch trellis. My heart was performing a complicated, nervous gymnastic routine inside my chest. It was Sunday. True to his word, Silas had fundamentally restructured his entire multi-billion-dollar empire in a matter of days, relocating his primary operations to San Francisco. And now, he was sitting beside me, impeccably dressed in a dark charcoal sweater and tailored slacks, preparing to meet my mother. "You are radiating anxiety, Julian," Silas observed softly. His hand reached across the center console, his long fingers wrapping gently over my knee. The familiar, grounding scent of frozen pine and dark earth washed over me, deliberately dialed down to a soothing hum. "Your cedar scent is completely entirely overwhelmed by stress. I am about to introduce the ice sovereign of the global tech market to a retired public school teacher who still thinks I need to eat more vegetables," I muttered, wiping my slightly damp palms on my thighs. "I think a little anxiety is biologically justified." Silas let out a low, rich chuckle that vibrated pleasantly against my senses. "I am not the ice sovereign today. I am simply a man attempting to make a good impression on the woman who raised the most remarkable alpha I have ever met." He leaned over, pressing a firm, reassuring kiss to my temple. The touch instantly settled my racing pulse. I took a deep breath, nodded, and pushed the car door open. When my mother, Eleanor, opened the front door, she froze. She was a gentle, perceptive beta woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, but even she was momentarily taken aback by the sheer, imposing physical presence of Silas Thorne standing on her welcome mat. Silas had meticulously reined in his Enigma pheromones, a sign of deep, instinctual respect, but his natural aura of authority was impossible to completely erase. "Mom," I smiled, stepping forward to give her a tight hug. "This is Silas." Silas stepped forward, offering a polite, respectful nod that I had never seen him give to anyone in a boardroom. "Mrs. Vance, it is an absolute honor to finally meet you." He didn't just bring a bottle of wine. During our flight, I had casually mentioned my mother's obsession with cultivating rare orchids, a hobby she had picked up after my father passed. From behind his back, Silas produced an exquisite, handcrafted glass terrarium housing a stunning, incredibly rare ghost orchid. My mother's eyes widened in sheer delight. "Oh my goodness. This is breathtaking. Julian, you didn't tell me he was so thoughtful." I shot Silas a look of pure, bewildered awe. He simply offered me a microscopic, devastatingly smug smirk before turning his full, charming attention back to my mother. "Julian speaks of you constantly, Mrs. Vance. It was the least I could do for invading your Sunday dinner." The evening that followed was the most surreal experience of my life. The terrifying CEO who had single-handedly threatened the entire Tokyo corporate elite was currently sitting at my childhood dining table, eating my mother's notoriously dry chicken casserole without a single flinch of hesitation. In fact, he smoothly asked for the recipe, claiming the herbs were remarkably balanced. I watched him, completely captivated. He was answering her questions about his business with patience, stripping away the intimidating financial jargon to explain his software infrastructure in a way that was engaging and accessible. He wasn't talking down to her. He was engaging with her respectfully. Then came the interrogation. My mother set down her fork, wiping her mouth with a napkin, and fixed Silas with a look that only a mother could wield. A look that completely ignored his billions of dollars and his Enigma status. "So, Silas," she said, her voice gentle but laced with absolute steel, "you are clearly a very powerful man, and my son is a very ambitious, brilliant young alpha who has worked himself to the bone for his company. What exactly are your intentions with Julian?" The air in the small dining room grew completely still. I held my breath, my alpha instincts suddenly flaring in a strange, protective panic. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't look away from her. He set his own fork down, his posture straightening slightly. The casual charm faded, replaced by that intense, terrifyingly sincere focus that always made my heart skip a beat. "My intentions, Mrs. Vance, are absolute," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that vibrated with raw honesty. "I intend to protect his vision, ensure his company changes the world, and provide him with an empire where he never has to beg for a seat at the table again." He paused, and for the first time all evening, he turned his icy gray eyes toward me. The look in his eyes was so profoundly deep, so entirely exposed, that it stripped away every defense I had left. "But more importantly," Silas continued softly, his gaze locked onto mine, "I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring he is happy. He is the only thing in this world I truly value. I love your son, Mrs. Vance, and I will never let him fall." Tears immediately pricked the corners of my eyes. A heavy, beautiful silence blanketed the room. I looked at my mother. She was staring at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears of her own. The fierce, protective steel in her posture melted away entirely. "Well," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly as she reached across the table to gently pat Silas's hand. "It seems I don't have to worry about him anymore. Welcome to the family, Silas." Later that night, the house was quiet. My mother had gone to sleep, and Silas and I were in my old childhood bedroom. The room was painfully small, the walls still bearing the faded marks of my teenage years. The twin-sized bed pushed against the wall was entirely inadequate for a man of Silas's size, but he didn't seem to care. He was sitting on the edge of the mattress, stripped down to his undershirt, watching me with a soft, heavy gaze as I locked the door. I walked over to him, standing between his parted knees. He immediately reached out, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pulling my hips flush against him. He buried his face in my stomach, inhaling deeply. "You handled her perfectly," I whispered, my fingers sinking into his dark, thick hair, gently massaging his scalp. "The ghost orchid was a brilliant move." "It was not a move," Silas murmured, his breath warm through the thin fabric of my shirt. He tilted his head up, looking at me in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. "I meant every word I said at that table, Julian." "I know." I breathed, my heart swelling with an emotion so massive it felt like it might break my ribs. I dropped to my knees in front of him, bringing myself to eye level with the enigma who had completely conquered my world. I reached out, tracing the sharp, beautiful line of his jaw. "I love you, Silas." I never thought I would say that to a rival CEO who used me as a pillow on a flight to Tokyo, but I do. Completely. Silas's eyes darkened, a flash of pure, primal possessiveness sweeping through his irises. The enigma pheromones he had been suppressing all evening finally broke free, flooding the small room with the intoxicating, heavy scent of a winter storm. He pulled me forward, capturing my lips in a kiss that was desperate, deep, and bruising. We fell back onto the narrow mattress, a tangle of limbs and desperate, burning heat. The small bed groaned under our combined weight, but neither of us cared. Silas's hands were everywhere, mapping my skin, worshipping every inch of my body as if I were the most precious thing he had ever touched. When his lips moved down my throat and found the fading mark he had left on my scent gland in Tokyo, he bit down again, not hard enough to break the skin, but enough to reassert his claim, sending a violent, ecstatic shockwave straight through my biology. That night, surrounded by the ghosts of my childhood, I gave myself entirely to Silas Thorne. Not as a business partner yielding to a merger, but as an alpha surrendering his soul to his true mate. Months blurred into a beautiful, chaotic reality. The Vance-Thorne partnership shook the global tech industry to its very foundations. With Silas's infinite capital and brutal protection shielding my company from corporate vultures, Vance Innovates battery cells hit the market and entirely revolutionized sustainable energy grids. We were on the cover of Forbes, labeled the most powerful power couple in Silicon Valley history. But the magazines didn't see the quiet moments. They didn't see the terrifying ice sovereign wearing reading glasses in bed, softly reading financial briefs while I rested my head on his chest. They didn't see the way his enigma aura would instantly soothe my anxiety after a brutal day of manufacturing delays. Exactly 1 year after the Tokyo summit, Silas and I were standing on the expansive glass-walled balcony of our shared San Francisco penthouse. The city lights glittered below us, a sprawling ocean of neon and progress. The cool night wind off the bay ruffled my hair. I was leaning against the glass railing, holding a glass of wine, when I felt the familiar, heavy warmth of Silas stepping up directly behind me. His arms wrapped around my waist, pulling my back firmly against his chest. I leaned into him instinctively, letting out a contented sigh as the scent of frozen pine completely enveloped me. "The Q3 reports look exceptional," I murmured, tilting my head back to rest against his shoulder. "We are projecting a 50% market share by December." "Forget the market share." Silas's low voice vibrated against my neck. I frowned slightly, turning my head to look at him. "Forget the market share. Silas, are you running a fever?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he gently turned me around so I was facing him. His gray eyes were intense, filled with that same earth-shattering sincerity he had shown in my mother's dining room. He reached into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a small, sleek black velvet box. My breath completely stopped. My heart slammed into my throat. Silas didn't drop to one knee. Enigmas didn't bow to anyone, and he knew I would have hated the cliché anyway. Instead, he opened the box right between us. Inside rested a stunning, minimalist band of dark brushed platinum, inlaid with a subtle, thin line of emerald, a quiet homage to the green tech empire we were building together. "I told you on that first day that I do not share, and I secure what I want," Silas said smoothly, though I could feel the faint, microscopic tremor in the hand holding the box, the only physical tell that the Ice Sovereign was nervous. "You gave me your company. You gave me your trust. Now, I want your eternity." Tears blurred my vision, a massive, overwhelming wave of pure joy crashing over me. "Julian Vance," Silas murmured, stepping closer, his presence the only thing anchoring me to the earth. "Marry me. Let me be the only man you ever fall asleep on for the rest of our lives." A watery, breathless laugh tore its way out of my throat. I didn't hesitate. I threw my arms around his neck, burying my face in the crook of his shoulder, inhaling the scent of the man who had completely changed my destiny. "Yes," I whispered fiercely against his skin. "Yes, absolutely." Silas exhaled a heavy, ragged breath of relief. He slid the heavy platinum band onto my finger, a perfect fit, before pulling me into a kiss that tasted of aged wine, frozen pine, and a promise of absolute forever. Looking back, the terrifying realization hadn't hit me when I woke up draped across the most ruthless enigma in the world. The realization hit me right now, standing on a balcony above the world with his ring on my finger. The flight to Tokyo was never a catastrophe. It was the universe violently shoving me into the arms of the man I was always meant to find. And as I held Silas Thorne, looking out over the empire we were building together, I knew that the Ice Sovereign had finally melted, and he belonged entirely to me. End of story. Wow, what a journey. Before we wrap up today's video, let's take a deep dive into the incredible dynamics and hidden layers of Julian and Silas's story. What makes this story so incredibly captivating is how it plays with the traditional power structures of the Omegaverse and corporate tropes. Julian is not a helpless character waiting to be saved. He is a proud, brilliant alpha CEO who built his empire from the ground up. He has a fierce, independent streak. That's exactly why Silas Thorne, the untouchable enigma, becomes so obsessed with him. Silas is a man used to people instantly bowing to his aura, but Julian fights back. The tension between them isn't just physical. It is a high-stakes chess game of intellect and pride. One of the most beautiful elements in this story is the use of pheromones as a storytelling device. At the beginning, Silas's scent, the frozen pine and crushed mint, is described as suffocating, terrifying, and demanding submission. It mirrors Julian's fear of losing his company and his autonomy. But as Silas's true intentions are revealed, that same scent transforms into a heavy, protective blanket. On the flip side, Julian's unexpectedly soft cedar and rain scent represents the vulnerability he hides beneath his sharp business suits. Silas is the only one who truly appreciates that softness, seeing it not as a weakness, but as Julian's most perfect trait. The true turning point of their relationship is the contract negotiation in the penthouse. Silas could have easily executed a hostile takeover. He had the money and the power to crush Vance Innovate, but he didn't. Instead, he offered Julian a bulletproof contract that protected Julian's life's work. Silas stripped away his own Ice Sovereign armor and essentially said, "I will give you everything, but you have to choose to walk through that door." It was a brilliant mix of absolute enigma dominance and deep, genuine respect for Julian as a partner. And we absolutely have to talk about the scene with Julian's mother. That moment grounds the entire story. It takes Silas Thorne out of the billion-dollar boardrooms and places him at a humble suburban dining table. By bringing the ghost orchid and facing a mother's fierce interrogation, Silas proves that he isn't just looking for a corporate merger or a temporary obsession. He was looking for a home. In the end, Silas didn't just conquer a rival CEO. He surrendered his own frozen heart to the only man brilliant enough to thaw it. What did you guys think of Silas and Julian's intense dynamic? Which scene was your absolute favorite? Let me know down in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and the analysis, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next romance. This has been your BL boyfriend, bringing you the best stories to make your heart race. See you in the next video.